Hello everyone, and welcome to Pearson Speaking About Pedagogy and Practice in English featured speaker series. I'm Steve McKay with the English marketing team, and I'm glad you could join us today. I hope that you find the ideas being presented by our speaker valuable for your classroom teaching. For those who are new to the webinar format, I have a few quick things to point out before the session begins. If you are calling in by phone, please know that this is not a toll-free number. For that reason, we recommend that you use mic and speakers in the control bar so that you can listen toll-free through your computer speakers. You may notice that your line has been muted. This is to minimize background noise or any interruptions to the presentation. We encourage you to ask questions by typing in the text box marked questions on the right side of your screen in the webinar dashboard. If your dashboard seems to have disappeared, hit the orange arrow and it will open back up. You can send us questions at any point, and when the formal presentation is over, we'll use the remaining time to pose as many of your questions as possible to our speaker. Any questions that we don't get to will be forwarded along with your email address to the speaker, so all questions will be answered one way or another. Please include your name and school at the beginning of your question if possible. We would like to invite you to keep up with the conversation on Twitter. If you're into live tweeting, we encourage that. And to do that, you would follow at Pearson North AM, which is short for Pearson North America. So again, it's at Pearson North AM, and use the hashtag PearsonLearn. Okay, so now for a quick introduction. Today's session is Putting Down the Pen, an Argument for Audio Commenting, and is being presented by Sarah DeBacher. Sarah is an administrator, teacher, community activist, mom, wife, but not necessarily in that order. She chairs the freshman writing program at the University of New Orleans and directs the Greater New Orleans Writing Project, which is also known as GNOWP. She has taught composition and creative writing courses for 10 years at UNO and a year at Tulane before that. Sarah helped restructure UNO's freshman writing curriculum, launched a popular regional conference on the teaching of writing known as WriteFest, attained grants for a GNOWP when federal funds dried up, and has provided over 100 hours of professional development in writing to K-12 teachers, teaching assistants, and college faculty. Sarah earned her MFA in creative writing at UNO in 2004 and her BA in English at the College of Wooster in 1997. She is the president of her neighborhood association in New Orleans' Lower 9th Ward, where she fights alongside her neighbors and her public school teacher husband for community-driven development. So after that very sterling bio, I'd like to see if Sarah is ready to start her presentation. Sarah, are you ready to be?
I am, yeah.
Great. Let's do that.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Let's see. Show my screen.
There we go.
There we go. Okay. All right, good. Well, thank you, Steve. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for giving me the time and to talk about audio feedback. I think that talk might not be the best word because I may come off a little bit evangelistic when it comes to audio commenting, so I may do a little bit of preaching. That's because moving away from writing on my students' essays and to recording audio comments has been the single most transformative change that I've made to my teaching over the past decade. It's changed my relationships with my students. It's had a positive impact on my students' writing, and I don't think I'm overstating things when I say that it has saved my life when it comes to the most time-consuming aspect of teaching, commenting on papers. As Steve mentioned in my introduction, I juggle multiple roles. I'm a mom, I'm a writing program administrator, writing project director, I'm a teacher, and of course I know that this is not an unusual thing in teacher circles or, as our students would put it, in today's society. So my hope for this presentation is that you will all come away from it with some ideas for making the task of commenting on student essays, or what we call grading papers in shorthand, a more sustainable, more productive enterprise on your end, and as well as a more useful one for your students. So, yay, let's begin. So I thought we would start with the voices of our students because for me, this presentation has its roots in listening to them talk about what they want from feedback on their writing. Each semester fairly early on, I prepare my students for peer review by having a discussion of helpful versus unhelpful feedback. And inevitably, those discussions turn into gripe sessions about feedback from their teachers. So through those conversations, and also by looking at their revisions after I'd given them written feedback, I discovered just how frequently my students were misinterpreting what I thought I'd said, and thus, unsurprisingly, generally not addressing my feedback in productive ways. I'm sure that you all have experienced this. We say awk, word choice, nice, cliche, and they hear no, 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 nice, no, no, no. And in conferences, I've discovered too that often an end note that was intended to offer a suggestion gets read instead as a command by my students, and that they really seem to be hearing hostility in my tone when I'd thought I was either being, supportive or at worst firm. When I've talked to my students about receiving written feedback, what they say sounds a lot like what the students featured in Nancy Sommer's video, Beyond the Red Ink, say about the written feedback they've received at Bunker Hill Community College. My intention, by the way, was to show you some of this video, but there are some technical limitations that prevent that. So I thought I'd share just a few quotes from the interviews with students about their teachers' comments on their writing. And by the way, I've placed a link at the top of this slide that I understand you should be able to click on once this webinar gets archived. So our students say when they see a discouraging comment, it makes them not want to write again. Another student says a lot of red sometimes can make a person give up. When I get back a paper that's just words crossed out, it feels absolutely terrible. I mean, are you just checking for grammar? Did you see the thought I put into this? And trying to decipher the words usually causes more problems, which I think my students, when I was writing on their papers, definitely struggled with. At the end of the Beyond the Red Ink video, student Jorge Garcia offers this advice to us writing teachers: write comments that begin conversations, not end them. So our students want comments that launch conversations. They want to know that their work has been read. They want complete thoughts. They want detailed explanations. They want more than mere corrections. They want specific suggestions for improvement. They want clarity. They want encouragement. They want empathy. This is a tall order. What our students, it seems to me, are really asking for are well-crafted, thoughtful mini-essays in response to their essays. And given the amount of time that it would take to give students what they want, it's no wonder that we teachers resort to the kinds of annotations and hieroglyphics, those shorthand marks that we use to get through a stack of essays. But what are our students learning from these textual annotations? I can recall receiving a draft back from a graduate professor of mine who'd peppered my manuscript with check marks, and I had no idea how to interpret them. On the one hand, I thought, okay, they're check marks, so they must indicate approval. But what exactly was he approving of? Some of the places he'd checked were, from my point of view, not all that great. So I also wondered if he'd use them perhaps as place markers to indicate where he'd need to return to reading after perhaps getting up for a glass of wine. Whatever his intention was in using those check marks, I wasn't getting the message. And I felt frustrated and frankly a little bit hurt. All that work, and in return I got rained on by check marks. My mom tells me a story about a professor's written feedback on an essay she got back when she was attending Teachers College. It read, quote, "good but could be better." And she really internalized that comment, so much so that it's become a bit of a family joke. That dinner she made, good, but could be better. The point that I'm trying to make here is that so much of our perception of our self-worth and so much of our students' perceptions of theirs, both as writers and as people comes from what others say. And in a culture where students spend the bulk of their formative years in the company of a teacher, what we teachers say about and on their essays has incredible significance. So the task of placing written feedback on student essays, the task of providing feedback in any form, really is fraught. Now, this is obviously not a real teacher comment, but I think it accurately represents both how we teachers feel about the task of making written comments and how our students feel about reading them. On our end, this feeling results in elaborate paper grading avoidance rituals. Nancy Sommers, an expert responder to student writing, has her own avoidance rituals. She requires, quote, lots of coffee and plenty of cookies. For me, it's lots of wine and microwave popcorn. She feels sudden desires to cook, to try new recipes, to clean, rearrange closets, check an email, return phone calls, anything, she writes, quote, to distract and comfort during the nights and weekends devoted to a tall stack of papers. Now, I'm sure that you can all probably tap into your feelings about grading papers, and you all have your own rituals. I sometimes imagine that our students have similar rituals for avoiding addressing our written comments, perhaps one of them being balling them up and throwing them away. What I'm getting at here, and I know that I don't need to tell you all this, is that there are often not good feelings associated with either writing on student essays or reading what's written on them. So why are our students seeing our comments in such a negative light? I think that perhaps it's because many, if not most of us, have had no real training in the enterprise of commenting on student writing, the thing that, if we're really being honest, we spend more time doing than we do talking with our actual students. Sommers and her colleagues researched the comments and commenting styles of 35 teachers at NYU and the University of Oklahoma, quote, attempting to discover not only what messages teachers give their students through their comments, but also what determines which of these comments the students choose to use or ignore while revising. The news, she reported from the findings of that research, is not good. The tendency of us writing teachers, she found, is to read students' essays not for meaning, as we might a letter or as we do when we read literature, but, quote, with biases about what the writer should have said or about what he or she should have written, and our biases determine how we will comprehend the text. When we do this, Sommers argues, we appropriate, we focus on our own purposes for writing rather than the students. We command. Our shorthand implies to our students that mastering writing is really about mastering a set of rules, when in reality, this formulaic approach to thinking and writing is something we should be encouraging them to move away from. Now, when I read Sommers' essay and later her book, and when I had these conversations with my students, I recognized that some of my own commenting styles were reflected in her not good news research and in my students' complaints. So I worked at changing my commenting practice in the only way I knew at the time that I could, which was by improving my written comments. I moved away from shorthand commands and focused instead on questioning. I stopped editing altogether and commented instead only on error patterns, providing when necessary a single paragraph of corrective modeling. I wrote the mini essays that my students were calling for at the ends of their papers using the NCTE endorsed and writing workshop lauded formula of praise, question, polish. So start with something that's working, move to something that's not working, and end with a suggestion for revisions. And yet, I still felt the same way about the task of commenting on student essays, and my students still seemed to perceive them in the same ways. When I handed back a batch of essays, I'd watch in dismay as they skipped over that carefully composed letter, scanning for a grade. I'd see clear frustration from them about any ink on their essays, even when that ink came in the form of questions and detailed suggestions. It was as though I had done what one of my husband's middle schoolers once said he'd done to her essay. I'd messed it up. And even after I'd improved my written feedback, both what I was saying and how I was going about it, I was still feeling the same frustration I had always felt when it came time to grade papers, my avoidance rituals growing ever more elaborate, and my need for wine increasing. Now, there was one venue where giving feedback felt both productive for me and welcomed by my students, and that venue was the individual conference. I used Donald Murray's excellent advice for conference teaching in his book, A Writer Teaches Writing, which meant that the students spoke first, that I didn't write on their essays, that they got to see me reading, really reading their essays, and that we could sit and have a conversation about their work, the kind of conversation about writing that Jorge Garcia said he wanted in that Sommers interview. This venue was and remains where my best teaching took place. But try as I might, I really could not agree with Murray's assessment of the practicality of conference teaching. Class sizes at my university have crept up twice in the past decade, so that most writing instructors on our campus are teaching a minimum of 100 students in 4 composition classes. Instructors are required in our program to assign a minimum of 3 projects. So assuming that each instructor met with every student at some point during each project, that would be 300 conferences. In preparing for this presentation, I was reviewing some of my go-to texts for responding to student writing, and I came across this marginalia from a previous owner of the book, a source book for responding to student writing, and that reader was writing in response to Peter Elbow's comment that he, quote, makes sure to have at least 3 conferences with each student each semester. And the reader wrote, I wish. I feel like this marginalia reveals both that it's become impractical in the current ecology of our comp teaching programs, but also that we who conference with students really do recognize that it's something we should be doing, that it is indeed where the best teaching takes place. So with this assumption in place, the question then becomes, how can we make the not in-person feedback on student writing that we're giving more like those in-person conferences? For me, audio feedback was that answer. It's just that I didn't really know it was a practical and effective alternative to written feedback until about 4 years ago. Then in 2011, I read an essay by Sarah Bauer that was published in the English Journal. This article, in tandem with a video on YouTube of Jim Burke actually providing audio feedback, and that video, by the way, appears to have been removed. At any rate, both of those things introduced me to audio feedback as the answer to this question of how to mimic conference teaching when conference teaching is impractical. As Burke's video illustrated, and as Bauer, and later I learned a whole host of writing teacher scholars pointed out, audio comments and similar voice-recorded strategies for commenting on student writing offer a real, practical alternative to conference teaching and are thus, as Bauer puts it, a powerful teaching tool. So what's the rationale for audio commenting that's reflected in research on its use? In other words, why do it? After 3 years of research, Chris Anson, who's the author of Talking About Text, the use of recorded commentary in response to student writing, reports that what he calls, quote, oral commentary, quote, surpasses written commentary on a number of dimensions, including amount of commentary. Teachers who used it provided an average of 780 words in 5 minutes, compared with their typical written responses, which were about 150 words. Of course, you all are probably wondering if it saves you time in response. Nancy Sommers' research shows that writing teachers spend an average of 30 minutes providing written feedback on a single student essay, longer if it's a second or third draft of an essay that includes research. Whereas using audio feedback, my own average reading and response time per student essay, no matter the draft type, is about 15 minutes. So it does save me time, which is important for all the obvious reasons, but particularly important given nationwide trends in increasing class sizes and the constant exhortations to do ever more with ever less. Additionally, it allows the teacher to be more specific in that time. Reading a clunky sentence or even one that sings out loud in order to highlight what's not working or what is easy when you're doing audio feedback. In written form, the teacher's focus tends to be on lower order concerns, the minutiae that don't make students better writer but do make students less confident ones. But you're simply not going to say awk in an audio file. Anson's research proves that in audio feedback, quote, teachers said more, explained more, and affectively were perceived by students to be supporting them a lot more. And that to me is huge. I'm supporting writers when I offer feedback, but I tend to lose sight of that when I'm isolated from them and faced by that daunting, impersonal stack of essays. You know, here are these things disembodied from their writers. Bell Hooks points out the risks of this kind of disembodiment in her book, Teaching to Transgress. And research by the National Writing Project further supports this notion that when we offer feedback, we need to remember that we are teaching writers to write. When I talk out my feedback, I really do feel as though I'm teaching and I'm talking to a writer. And when I'm talking to writers instead of at or on an essay, I'm more relaxed, I'm happier. If you were to come into my office while I'm providing audio feedback, you'd see me gesturing, smiling, you'd hear it in my voice. I am part of a conversation. Now on the student end, our writers get more useful and encouraging feedback. Obviously they benefit from the greater specificity that audio feedback allows, but let's say the draft needs significant improvement. No matter how supportively an instructor attempts to frame constructive criticism in writing, as we've seen in earlier slides, students often perceive those comments as personal attacks. Again, Anson has found that teachers who use audio commentary are perceived to be more supportive. Furthermore, it forces students to engage with our feedback. As Anson writes, audio feedback, quote, controls the student's focus. The teacher leads the student through the commentary instead of the student deciding what to look at. So our audio feedback provides much more than a mere grade and ensures that students are hearing the feedback that we're giving. Now, audio feedback may control the student's focus, but it doesn't control their writing. When we are not writing on a student's text, but instead are talking with them about the words they use to make meaning for us, for their readers, we reinforce their role as the authors, as the writers of those words. And of course, not only is giving audio feedback more pleasant for the teacher, getting it is also more pleasant for the students. So beginning in the spring of 2011, this became the new paper grading me. At the time, I was teaching 2 comp classes, each with approximately 20 students, and I decided that I'd give my students the option to either receive written feedback or audio feedback, in part because I was still a little anxious about this major shift, and in part because I was curious about what my students would choose. About half of them elected to receive audio feedback, and I noticed immediately how much more pleasant giving audio feedback was. I remember one Saturday sitting on my back porch, my messy back porch, birds chirping, sun shining, cool breeze blowing, and there I was talking to my students and feeling like I was getting away with something. I mean, the initial transition, while accompanied by a few hiccups and do-overs, was blissful. I, of course, will not pretend that I was suddenly excited about grading papers, but I didn't dread it either, and that for me was huge. That semester spent grading half the papers orally and half the papers in writing really made the difference clear. And so from the fall of 2012 on, I've shifted entirely to audio feedback. Now, there are some practical considerations that accompany this shift that, if you're considering it, you'll need to think about. Chris Anson outlines these in his essay, Talking About Text, the Use of Recorded Commentary in Response to Student Writing. You'll need to consider whether you're going to comment on drafts or revisions or both. I try to conference with students over early drafts, and then I pick up on those conversations in an audio file that accompanies a graded revision. This may seem obvious, but you will need to decide what recording device works best with your computer software and with whatever computers are on your campus. I use the Voice Memos app that comes loaded with the iPhone 5S, which allows me to email the file directly from my phone to my contacts. It also, however, limits the emailable file length to 8 minutes. So for me, that 8 minute length acts as my time limit. When I first started giving audio feedback, I frequently wound up sending 2 separate 8-minute files, and frankly, I wasn't really saving that much time initially. But once I grew accustomed to the format, I found that 8 minutes was really the perfect amount of time. I do know many teachers who use Jing, which is a screen capture and video feedback format, and I believe the free version limits files to 5 minutes. So your technology may have an impact on your decision about time. You'll also need to decide how to organize your comments. This decision probably makes the biggest difference in terms of students' experience of your feedback. You can opt to read the essay live and pause your device after each paragraph, or you can opt, as I do, to give feedback after reading the entire essay. And finally, you'll have to decide whether or not you'll write on the students, or whether or what you'll write on the students' essays. The only writing that I do is to underline a sentence, or sometimes I might put an arrow or an asterisk next to a paragraph that I plan to address in my comments. But other than that, it's hands-off for me. The only other writing I do on my students' essays are their paragraph numbers, which actually I moved to having them write on their essays on submission day, which really simplifies the process for me. I did at one time use Post-it notes. I was trying so badly to avoid any appropriation of student text, but that became impractical due to budget cuts. So we have come to the moment that I'm sure you've all been waiting for, a demonstration of what audio feedback sounds like. Now I'm going to play this. I hope this works. I think it will. Directly from my iPhone, and I'm just going to play a brief excerpt, in part because I'm a little worried about the sound quality. So Steve, I'm going to trust you to interrupt if I need to stop and immediately move on, but my plan is to play about 2 minutes. So let's see how this goes.
Hi, Susie. It's Ms. D, and I'm here to give you some feedback on your first long essay. This is the informal research essay. You've titled yours Banksy, Genius, or Criminal, and you explained that your purpose in this essay is to explore whether Banksy should be considered a genius or a criminal. I want to begin by saying that I really enjoyed reading this piece. After having talked with you in conference about it, I was really pleased to see how, particularly toward the end of your essay, your research question really does find its answer, that you really do seem to respond to that question that you articulate at the end of paragraph 1 when you write, I'm a big admirer of Banksy's work, but recently I've begun to ask myself what should be done in case that the authorities find him. Having a little bit of trouble there. You might want to check out that sentence. Should he be arrested? Should he be forgiven because of his talent? What makes him so different from other graffiti artists that have been punished for their work? And I really think that, you know, particularly in New Orleans, where we're finding all of our, or so many of our buildings and lots of abandoned structures really covered in graffiti and in tags, this is a particularly relevant and timely issue for your New Orleans readers. And that question is a really interesting research question. It doesn't have easy answers. There's a conversation already going on out there about it, in which you can insert your voice. You know, you can become part of that conversation. So I'm just really excited about this research question, and I'm glad to see that you have articulated it really pretty clearly here in this essay.
Okay, so I just wanted to play a little bit there. So that was an audio file that I did this morning. I wouldn't call it my best feedback. For instance, I'm a little bit repetitive in referring both to her title and to her statement of purpose, which were essentially one and the same. But I do think that, or I hope that this imperfect quality makes my feedback more approachable to my students, more like a real conversation. And in selecting an imperfect example, I hope that you will find it more approachable yourselves, that you'll find this a little more doable. And if we return briefly to this slide, this earlier slide outlining what it is our students want from our feedback, I do think that you will find all of this in the file I played. I read directly from Susie's essay. I'm even able to point out a clunky spot that I read aloud. I refer to the expectations of the genre. I convey excitement and enthusiasm for her subject and for her personal progress. And I'm able to refer to a previous conversation that we had in a conference reinforcing this notion that I really want to reinforce for my students, that writing is a process. If I'd played that file in its entirety, you would have heard me go on to say that while she does articulate an answer to her research question, she could do more to include other voices in the already ongoing academic conversation by researching answers to a couple of secondary questions that still remain. Now, you might have found all of this in my very best written feedback. You might have, but it takes an incredible amount of time to pull that off. So for me, audio commenting is a practical method of delivering what my students want and, of course, what I believe any writer deserves. So what do students say about this method of feedback? Here are just a few comments from my teaching evaluations. I ask students to comment on this strategy in particular because, of course, I'm always interested in improving it. But I find more compelling this recent qualitative study that was presented at the 2012 4Cs convention at a workshop on audio comments by 7 composition teachers and scholars, including Jeff Sommers, whose scholarship on the subject I referred to earlier. If you are watching the archived version of this presentation, you should be able to click on the words qualitative study and get taken to a wealth of resources on audio commenting compiled by that workshop's facilitators. Their research involved 2 phases. In the first, 197 students completed a survey on commentary preferences, and you can see here, 176 of them preferred audio feedback. 8 respondents preferred handwritten feedback. 13 of them would prefer both. Well, wouldn't we all? I want it all, the American way, right? In phase 2, 20 students were interviewed on commentary preferences. And those findings show that students prefer audio feedback to handwritten because it helps increase their confidence and motivation, helped them to internalize feedback, gave them more feedback for revision, reduced their misinterpretation of feedback, and importantly, that audio strengthened the student-professor bond. So these findings demonstrate strong preference for audio feedback from students, which is something I've certainly seen borne out in my classes. Now, having fully implemented audio feedback in my writing classes, I've now become interested in other applications for audio feedback. In talking about text, Jeff Sommers describes a kind of audio author's note or letter of reflection to launch the instructor's feedback. At the time, the students submitted that recorded on a cassette tape. I have my students compose an author's note that accompanies their essays, which sets the stage for my feedback, but I can certainly see them submitting those with MP3 or M4A files, supporting that feeling of a conversation that's happening between writer and teacher or writer and audience. The 2008 essay, Can You Hear Us Now? A comparison of peer review quality when students give audio versus written feedback, found that the authors of that found that the quality of the comments was, quote, significantly higher than the quality of the written comments. So this could really benefit peer review, particularly when students are in an online course, a venue that, of course, can feel really impersonal. Other research findings support the use of audio feedback in campus writing centers. And, of course, many teachers are combining audio feedback with screen capturing software, which allows more control over students' reading of the feedback. So there are certainly other applications to explore. By the way, there is a wealth of research on audio feedback out there. I'd certainly recommend checking out the WPA comp pile and searching the archive listserv. This list of resources is one that I've culled from those two places. YouTube is also a good resource for additional demonstrations, and I'm happy, of course, to share any of the classroom resources that I've developed to accompany audio feedback. My email will be on the last slide. We are getting there. So before I close, I'd like to share a brief passage from the introduction of Richard Straub's source book for responding to student writing, which is, by the way, an excellent resource for anyone who's wishing to examine your own responding practices, or anyone who is, as I am, charged with mentoring new teachers or providing professional development. Straub writes, quote, "This book," and here I'd like to insert this presentation, is, quote, "predicated on the belief that there is no single best way of teaching writing and no single best way of responding to student writing. Different teachers in different settings with different students, different kinds of writing, different course goals, and alas, with different time constraints, may do different things with their comments and do them well. Ultimately, it comes down to what works best for us as individual teachers and what can be made to work best for this particular student with this paper in this setting at this time. The best teachers," Straub writes, "are not those who know the most or have all the answers or do all the right things. The best teachers are those who keep on teaching themselves and are continually finding new ways to help students learn." So what I've shared with you today is my own story of how I came to audio feedback as a good fit for me and my students, but I really look forward to learning from you, and so I hope that you will share some of your own successes, perhaps some of your failures, and of course I am happy to answer any questions that you might have. So ask away.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a really wonderful presentation. I know personally I learned a lot. It was all new information, but I was really intrigued by what you had to say about audio commenting. We would encourage all of our attendees to send in their questions by typing into the questions box and sending those to us. As we wait for those to come in, I know it takes a while for people to compose their comments and questions and type that out. I had a question that occurred to me as you were giving your presentation, and it had to do with confirming. Is there a way to confirm that the student has listened to the audio commenting?
I don't know of like a technical way of confirming. I mean, I haven't. I wonder if some of those, like Moodle or Blackboard, or if you can see that a student has opened that file. I don't know of any way of doing that. For me, of course, confirming that my students have listened to the feedback is confirmed in the same way that I was able to confirm that they read it. I look for evidence in their revisions. But another thing that I've started doing, because I've noticed that a practical consideration that made audio feedback a little bit challenging for me was when I would grade a revision, I wanted to look back at what I'd previously said, and I don't have the time to re-listen to those files. And there's an advantage of written feedback. You would be able to scan your written feedback really quickly and remember what it was that you'd written on that previous draft. So what I've started doing, and I'm really pleased with this, because I feel like, again, it reinforces this notion of the conversation that should happen between writer and reader. I've started having my students write a note to me that accompanies after they've gotten audio feedback from me. So in other words, I have them say to me, "Dear Ms. D, what I really like about your comments is something that I want to know more about is," so I'm having them summarize my comments. So I know that they've read it in that way, or listened to it in that way, by having them write to me about that feedback. And again, sort of, opening up the conversation on their end.
Great. We have a couple of questions that have come in. They're from G.L. Henderson, and he asks, "I teach online and use audio feedback through Acrobat audio annotations. Have you tried that method?"
No. I'm writing it down. I know that I have tried, for instance, the embedded I think this is just in Word, where you can embed an audio comment within the file itself. For me, the time consideration is it's really very real. You know,
Sure.
I really needed to find ways of shortening the amount of time that I'm spending in student writing while reinforcing that quality. And I find that when I stop in that way, like when I embed the audio feedback, it was simply taking me more time. But one of the things that I think is really cool about that type of, if I'm understanding it correctly, you know, the audio comment would be embedded there within the text. What I think is really cool about that is, you know, it further controls what the student is focusing on, so minimizing those misinterpretations.
Great, very helpful. We did have another question that came in. Practically speaking, instructors like to know what they've said on students' previous essays as when those students submit revisions. How do you revisit your comments without having to listen to the whole file again? You may have already addressed this in your other.
Yeah, I just think that, you know, having students summarize, although at first I thought, oh, well, I'll just have them summarize, and then I thought, well, that's kind of rude, you know. Why don't you summarize what I've said? It seemed like I was kind of, I mean, I already felt like I was getting away with something, but maybe a little bit too authoritative to have them summarize my comments. But within that letter, and I'm happy to share that that particular writing prompt, you know, I'm very explicit with my students about the conditions in which I want them to listen to my comments, and then I give them something very specific that they do, which is to write back to me. And so I'm able to refer to their letters to me, and usually that jogs my memory.
Okay. And then do you write the grade on the paper, or how do you handle announcing the grade?
Yes. So I use portfolio grading, so I would not be grading those the revisions other than to give them a credit award. But I typically embed that credit award within the file, you know, sneakily forcing them to listen to the entire file. I don't, you know, there's not really a shape or a certain place where I put it because, again, I really want to make sure that those students are listening to the file. But I don't write it on the essay because, you know, I feel like if I were to do that, they would do the same things that students would do the same things that they might tend to do when they receive written feedback, which is just to skim over the comments and focus solely on the grade.
Great. We have another question that came in from Jackie Justice. She asks, I regularly teach freshman writing courses in which one of the baseline requirements is control of the mechanics of documentation. How do you respond to these mechanical requirements in a meaningful way through these audio comments?
Yeah, so the file that I played earlier, you know, you could hear me stumble over that one sentence, and that was, you know, one way that I was letting Susie know that there was a trouble sentence there. But again, I think one of the advantages of audio commenting is it does focus the instructor on higher order concerns. But I think what Jackie's pointing out is that one of those error patterns might be documenting. So I would simply mention that as an error pattern, maybe put an arrow or underline one of those errors in a particular paragraph, and talk about it to the student. Again, you know, looking for a pattern, finding a specific example, and it's really much easier for me to provide those specific examples when I'm talking them out, because of course, you know, I would need to write 4 and 5 and 6 sentences in order to explain the complexities of MLA formatting or APA formatting, whereas I can say that much faster.
Great. Well, those are the questions that we've received so far. I wanted to thank everyone for attending. This has been a really wonderful presentation. I think Sarah had her email address up on her last slide, and hopefully you wrote that down. If not, I wanted to remind our attendees that we've recorded this presentation, and it'll be posted on our Pedagogy and Practice website. It usually takes a day. The latest it would be posted would be Monday, but hopefully it'll be Friday tomorrow. And we're going to post both the recording of this presentation as well as Sarah's PowerPoint file. So any of the hyperlinks that are embedded in those files, you can access those through our website. And you will receive an email with the link and how to get to that website. So Thank you all so much for attending. Sarah, did you have any other comments for us today?
No, just thank you, and I really oddly, is it odd? I don't know. I love talking about this stuff, and I really love learning from other teachers. So I hope that any of you who want to extend the conversation will please email me, and I promise I'll respond. Thank you, Steve.
Oh, thank you. And I wanted to remind our listeners that we also have a full day of webinars coming up a week from today, on Thursday, March 26th, starting at 10 a.m. On the East Coast time. And you're invited to join us for all 6 sessions or just 1 or 2. The topic of the day is course redesign. And the slide is up now. You can see that we have some wonderful presenters, and we're hoping that you can join us. But in the meantime, thank you so much, Sarah. We really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.